but in the name of oversimplified market efficiency, entire supply chains of strategic goods moved overseas.
We don't have good tools that create patient capital.
That requires a continuous surface presence in the polar regions, both to combat the Russians' aggression, but also to limit China's ability to gain influence.
Welcome to China Talk, the podcast where we break the ice on international relations, and not just in the Arctic. I am your host, Jordan Snyder, and today we are diving into a topic that is no joke: icebreakers and the Ice Pact. It's like Canada, Finland, and the United States all swiped right on Arctic cooperation, and now they're taking the relationship to the next level. Today we have on to discuss William Henagan and Robert Obayda, both directors on the NSC. We're also going to talk about industrial policy more broadly, cranes, but first you're going to get some one-liners. What's an icebreaker's idea of a hot date? Anything above freezing? What do you call it when an icebreaker gets stood up? The cold shoulder. And why are icebreakers always single? They keep breaking up with everyone. Co-hosting Alexander Boyd, we're going to try to talk intern currently at the China Digital Times. Robert, what's the case for industrial policy?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Under President Biden, the NSC has been pursuing a modern industrial strategy, which is really the convergence of economic and national security strategies. So basically, if we invest in our economy, we will advance our national security. And I think there are sort of two key assumptions worth mentioning that sort of underpin the whole thing. And the first is that the modern vision of public investment is that markets always allocate capital productively and efficiently, no matter what our competitors did, no matter how big our shared challenges grew, or no matter how many guardrails we took down. And I don't think that anyone is discounting the power of markets, but in the name of oversimplified market efficiency, entire supply chains of strategic goods, along with industries and jobs that made them, moved overseas. Another embedded assumption was that the type of economic growth did not matter. All growth was good growth. And so various reforms came together that strengthened some sectors of the economy, like finance, while other essential sectors like semiconductors and infrastructure atrophied. And as a result, our industrial capacity, which is crucial to the country's ability to continue to innovate, took a real hit. And so the problem with this approach is that it sort of assumes the free market is equally free in each country and that no one government is interfering to advance their own interests at a scale large enough to create an imbalance. And so, like, if you look at the PRC efforts to create market entry barriers around strategically important sectors and cultivating those sectors through various government subsidies, you'll see it's no longer, in fact, free per se. So we've created a strategy to compete with that. And that strategy, that modern and American industrial strategy, is one where we identify specific sectors that are foundational to economic growth and strategic from a national security perspective, and where the private sector on its own isn't exactly poised to make the investments needed to secure our national ambitions.
Gotcha. So, what is the screen in Bloomberg that led you guys to icebreakers and cranes as the first two?
Just honestly, general interest. We read the strategy. We both thought it was brilliant and wanted to see if we could apply it. And so started looking at sectors that sort of fit the bill. And for a variety of reasons, I think cranes just kind of presented itself as the first one, and then icebreakers after that.
So when you talk about presented itself, is that the fundamentals matching the opportunity and excitement, or a little more on the sort of decision matrix that leads you guys to investing time and energy in one versus another?
Yeah, I think maybe I can jump in and take that one. I think our industrial strategy is a 10,000 foot view of this stuff. And then what we do is we dial into sort of sectors of strategic importance. So chips, super obvious one, our efforts to facilitate the clean energy transition, and some of our infrastructure investments. I think in this case, we're looking at places where there's intense market concentration in the PRC predominantly, but really we'd be concerned about market concentration in any country, particularly on the crane example that has such a significant position in the market for a product or a service that is like critically important to global supply chains. So on the cranes example, right, it's like those things are the things that pick the container up off the ship and they put it on the dock. And basically some incredible percentage, like 80-90% of all goods in the world are flowing through those assets. And so the question is one of like resilience versus dominance, I think. So like on a lot of the places where you've seen those big, huge sort of like public investments, chips, et cetera, we're looking to actually like lead the world, be dominant. But I think cranes and icebreakers and some of our shipbuilding work, this is probably more in like the resilience category of the industrial strategy. So how do we think about strategic sectors and strategic types of products that we need to make and we need to be good at making, and we need our allies and partners to be good at making, so that there is a diversity within our supply chains and our economies are resilient to shocks of any kind. So I think that's a little bit of how we were dialed in on that, and it's probably worth like backing up. And Robert and I, when we started that work, were in our sort of office on the homeland side that works on critical infrastructure protection. Before that, Robert was at Treasury, and I was working on our infrastructure implementation team under Mitch Landrieu. So we were trying to think through sort of as we do the implementation of the sort of multi-trillion-dollar spending package under the Investing in America agenda, so bill, CHIPS, IRA, we were looking at sort of like some of these questions of where do we need to be resilient and where do we need to protect pieces of our economy? Do we have sort of like a minimum level capability necessary to keep that capacity here in the United States, and also prove out this case, which is that our national security policy can facilitate strong industrial policy. It can facilitate economic growth and is tied to a foreign policy for the middle class. You can tie that connection straight from what it is we're trying to do abroad to how it's helping sort of everyday Americans at home.
Great. So let's talk through some of the tools that you guys have deployed for cranes and icebreakers. So, the CHIPS Act, as China Talk listeners hopefully are familiar with at this point, we had grants, we had loans, we had tax credits, and then we had this big R&D portion in the NSTC. What are some tricks up your sleeve?
Yeah, I think this is like a good place to talk about sort of like what we're good at and what we're not so good at as an American government, right? Like we have like a really robust set of like restrictive tools of economic statecraft. So we've got tariffs, we've got export controls, et cetera. And then we've got the ability, at least under the sort of last 3 or 4 years, to make real investment the domestic side of our government into our domestic space. One of the things we're not so good at and what we're trying to figure out how do we build out now as we try to do industrial policy at home and abroad, alongside our allies and partners, sort of like centered in this view that alliances are super important, is what are the affirmative tools of economic statecraft? We have a really hard time investing abroad. We don't have good tools of that create patient capital that we can invest here or in other countries. I think those are some of the questions that people are starting to raise now as we get like more sophisticated about the way we try to strategically invest as a government. And we learn from the work that we've been doing over the last 3 years, which I think is getting sort of, a lot of bipartisan support and is something that's going to be carried forward as you see sort of a convergence of economic and national security policymaking in the American system.
Robert, so you spent some time in Treasury before this on the sort of stick side of things and the, sanctions and OFAC world. That's like at some level a more straightforward thing to just say like, no, you can't do this. And then you have to like fight off lobbyists or whatever. But like incenting people to do positive things where all the cards aren't necessarily with the government at the end of the day is a much more, like amorphous and tricky task.
I mean, I think that the Treasury Department's interesting because it has such a long history of private partner relations and frankly needs the private sector to mitigate the risks that it sees in the world. But the approach has always been using a variety of sticks, like sanctions and regulations to mitigate that. Because we sort of accept that the private sector is not driven by national security, it's driven by profit. And what our industrial policy is really doing is saying that not only do we need to use sticks, we can also use carrots. by creating market incentives for private sector partners to act in a way that actually advances our national security.
All right, so let's jump into our case studies. Start with cranes. What were some of the carrots that you were able to put on the table?
The sticks that we were using was ultimately what led to the carrots. We were going to use basically regulation and tariffs to mitigate the risk, but that was going to inevitably create a sort of gap in the market that we would need to fill. And that's what forced us to start looking at how do we incentivize private sector to sort of step in and fill that demand.
Yeah, if we go back to like the beginning of this year, right? So we're thinking about putting out this maritime security directive, is what it's called, which is basically like a order from the Coast Guard that says, all these ship sort of ports across the country need to take a look at their ship-to-shore cranes, figure out if they're made in the PRC, do some cybersecurity hygiene work on them, and then report back to the captain of the port. That's sort of like, that ups the cyber compliance cost of having a crane manufactured in the PRC in your port. It's sort of onerous. And if you're thinking about sort of like, okay, there's some risk here, there's some concerns about whether or not a ship-to-shore crane built in the PRC is the type of asset that I want to have in my port environment in the United States. The question that you're asking yourself as a port authority or as a terminal operator is, where can I buy an alternative? Like the largest PRC-based company that makes ship-to-shore cranes is ZPMC. And your alternatives, basically, when we went out and started looking around the world, are largely in Japan, Finland, and Germany. So these are, close allies and partners of the United States. And when we were putting that together, we were like, okay, we're going to create this question in the market. And like, what is the answer? And so that's when we reached out to TUI ENS, which is the Japan-based company that makes ship-to-shore. And we started talking about like, what would it take to encourage you to put a facility in the United States to assemble these cranes, or at a minimum to just begin to do more CapEx investment in Japan to try to provide the necessary economies of scale and the types of capacity to meet the need in the United States if people are looking for PRC alternatives. And what we were able to do is work closely with them throughout that process. And as we were releasing the Maritime Security Directive, we were able to put out, they put out a statement that said, we're working on investing in the United States. We're working on expanding our operations in Japan. And we've been able to have good, productive conversations and relationships with a variety of the sort of allied and partner-based producers of cranes, and begin to sort of encourage folks to think about those as trusted suppliers and as alternatives. That's sort of the positive story. And we started looking at grant dollars so we did a survey of every infrastructure investment program where there could be eligibility to purchase a ship-to-shore crane, the Ports Infrastructure Development Program at the Department of Transportation, the EPA Clean Ports Program. And we started pointing people towards those, say those are federal dollars. But the thing about federal money, right, is that it has to be Build America, Buy America Act compliant when you use it to build something in a port or anywhere in the United States, really. And so that's when, instead of, you can't then source that from Japan, you have to source that from the United States. And so that's the pull factor that we can use. That's one of the carrots in our industrial policy. We can say to, big multinational companies, hey, set up operations in the United States so that you can take advantage of the sort of generational investment in American infrastructure that's going on right now through the sort of administration's broader investing in America, industrial policy agenda, whatever you want to call it. And that's how we were able to sort of bring that positive side, as opposed to just making this a story about restrictive tools tariffs or security directives or what have you. That's sort of the crane story. And I think that's one of that sort of canvassing is one of the ways we tried to use affirmative tools. But it would be great if we had more tools to be able to do that, particularly on these sectors where we didn't invest $100 million, $500 million, $1 billion in ship-to-shore crane replacement through the infrastructure law. We're trying to sort of like look for the dollars and cents that make sense, that allow us to carry forward this type of industrial policymaking in combination with our other tools. So that's sort of how we're thinking about it. And the markets are dynamic. Like that's, grains came up because it was a relevant security threat at the time. Icebreakers came up because we're trying to figure out a case study for how do we do American shipbuilding, and what's the kind of vessel that we might want to do, that we might want to use as a proof case for the types of ships that can be made here efficiently, effectively, and at scale. So that's sort of, I think, how we got there.
Let's go from that to our icebreaker conversation. So, from a macro perspective, there is a fascinating chart of the percentage of total ships launched over the course of the 20th and 21st century, where basically like you have these crazy spikes where it's like all America from like 1916 to 1918, and then like 90% America from like 1940 to 1945. But basically since then, over the course of the second half of the 20th century, you had Europe and Scandinavia like tailing off, Japan having a nice run in there, Korea showing up. But the sort of rise of China to over, I think, like 50 or 60% of global ship tonnage launched over the past really 10 or 15 years is a remarkable sort of change in the global dynamics. Like America has basically been out of this for 50 years now, but things were like kind of chill when it was Korea and Japan making all the ships, and maybe a little less so when it's China. So icebreakers are a particularly interesting case study because they're like actually really cool and very specialized and unique. What do icebreakers do? I had a really fantastic YouTube wormhole last night. Like they're incredibly powerful, and the way they break the ice is they kind of like go, like they push themselves like over them and then fall down on the ice. Russia has nuclear powered ones, and the Finns have these ones that they kind of like, it's almost like Tokyo Drift. Like they go like sideways or at like a 2/3 angle. So they're clearing out like a wider track than, the actual width of the ship could get you. And anyways, these are important for lots of reasons. For Russia in particular, like it opens up sort of trade routes, which would be closed otherwise for many months of the year. But why don't you guys make the case that like America should care about icebreakers? I know like some like boats get stuck around Alaska every once in a while, but that's probably not enough to get some folks on the NSC spending long nights and weekends to put something like this together.
Totally. Yeah, I think like the place to start there, right, is where you started, which is like, what's the global shipbuilding picture look like today versus historically? I think you hit the history of this well over the last like 200-300 years. If you really look at it, there's never been more than sort of like one or two major powers who are like dominating the global order book, and that's evolved sort of over the last like 2 centuries. It was America at the beginning of the 20th century, and then it evolves to the UK, to the Japanese, to the South Koreans, and now we're in sort of a ascendant PRC moment on shipbuilding. Like this year, the latest numbers I think is like of the global order book by tonnage, the PRC is going to be at like 49% of the global order book. South Korea is like in the 30% range. Japan's closer to 10-13%. The United States, I think, is importantly at 0.2%. And tonnage as a metric isn't like the perfect way to talk about icebreakers, because that figure is sort of about ships linked to freight rates. So it's sort of how much goods can a ship carry. And icebreakers aren't necessarily like carrying huge quantities of commodities or something from point A to point B. But what they are doing, and one of the reasons we care a lot about them, is that they open shipping pathways. And I think as we see the effects of climate change, ironically, begin to lessen the thickness of the sea ice in certain places like the Northwest Passage, what we get is an increase in demand, at least in the medium term, for these types of vessels. And so as we were thinking about this problem of shipbuilding as a sector that we needed to care about in our industrial strategy, I think our theory of the case was, how do we compete against countries that already have huge economies of scale in shipbuilding? So like we're not going to be able to build here at scale 49% of the global order book to build the kind of like bulk carriers that carry our commodities, or, LNG carriers or whatever it might be. Those like relatively simple ships that move goods around the world. But what we do think we can be sort of best in class at is building the kinds of like high tech, high specialty ships, which are difficult to build. They require precision manufacturing. They require a lot of design IP. That's the kind of area of the economy where the U.S. has traditionally been dominant, and you see it's sort of similar, analogous, not a perfect analogy, but on the chip side, and sort of the legacy versus leading chips dynamic. I think that's how we ended up on Icebreakers, which is sort of like the perfect example of an ultra specialty, ultra complicated, sort of like high IP need ship. And also we started looking around the world and we're like, who's got the best IP, who's got the best capability, the best know-how? It's America's allies and partners, Canada, Finland, some other countries. So that's, I think, how we landed on Icebreakers. And we were like, if we're going to be serious about changing the global order book share of the United States from 0.2% up to, maybe 1%, 2%, which in sort of our conjecture is, I think, what we think we may need in order to sort of have the kind of shipyard capacity that's necessary to have a resilient shipbuilding economy here in the United States, which in times of war can be converted to support our naval shipbuilding effort, or build the kinds of cargo ships that you would need to support a warfighting effort. That's where you start to get really interested by the NSC in types of vessel classes that are going to be successful when they're built here in the United States. And so that's how we landed on Icebreakers. And I think what we're trying to do with IcePact is demonstrate that you can do that kind of industrial policy with your allies and partners. Like that's I think one of the things we're trying to prove out, which has been one of the big critiques of like our industrial strategy, is how do you do that in an alliance forward fashion? And in this case, like, we're going to create jobs here in the United States by building Icebreakers, and we're going to do it alongside some of our, closest friends and allies, while sending important sort of geopolitical signals to our adversaries.
Yeah, I think the bottom line that we were using as we sort of navigated the process is that, we, the United States, are committed to projecting power into the high latitudes alongside our allies and partners, and frankly, that requires a continuous surface presence in the polar regions, both to combat the Russians, combat Russian aggression, but also to limit China's ability to gain influence. And sort of without this arrangement, we risk our adversaries developing an advantage in a technology with geostrategic importance, which could also allow them to become the preferred supplier to other countries with an interest in purchasing icebreakers. It's in our interest, both from a geostrategic perspective, but then also from an economic perspective, to move forward and try and pull this together.
So, Robert, I understand all of that. Have you guys thought about also making the ice around Russia colder?
Yeah, we're working with the Emiratis on that, actually.
Well, William, so what you just described there sounds a lot like a concept that should be familiar to China Talk listeners, which is civil military fusion, where, it's controversial Chinese industrial policy, essentially. And so I'm wondering, how does it differ from Chinese policy, which President Biden has specifically said he's looking at pretty hard? What makes this American as opposed to just copying what the Chinese have done?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the key differences here, right, as we've looked pretty hard at this problem, is the overlap in the civil fusion concept and the PRC. And I'm not going to claim to be a PRC expert here. We're the econ industrial policy guys from the White House, not necessarily our China team. What I would say is that overlap in sort of building those hulls in the same shipyards. I think the evidence isn't necessarily there about how that creates the kinds of economies of scale, because the type of work to build an icebreaker or to build a warship, the types of specialty skills that you need, types of specialty materials, isn't a one-to-one match. But what is important is the ability to have healthy shipyards, which have the ability to build all of the associated vessels that are necessary for a country to stay competitive, either during a time of war or during a time of peace, frankly. And it's about increasing the density of the supplier base that supports American shipyards. It's about increasing the demand for the key inputs. You can bend the economies of scale on steel to drive down steel production costs. Like, there's like a lot of non-market policies and practices that I think that BRC are using to drop input costs to, help keep those different shipyards afloat. I think that as a policy for the United States is like probably like not the way we would go. But I think there is like a really interesting opportunities to be strategic about the way we invest in shipbuilding here that helps build the density of skilled labor and skilled workforce that's good at building ships, that's good at sophisticated kinds of welding, that pulls in the kinds of auxiliary businesses that are necessary to make the component parts of ships where there is overlap. And ultimately that you have like there's sort of a growing number of healthy shipyards that have long, strong order books, which are capable of taking on or bidding for Navy contracts and have sort of like the muscle memory and the know-how to do that. So it's not a perfect one-to-one on like what the PRC is doing and what we would suggest that we do here. But I do think that there's like reasonable sort of like parallels to be drawn because they were thinking about it, maybe 10, 20 years ago. We're thinking about it much, much harder now. It's how do you create a strong shipbuilding sector in your country? And I don't think that the United States is going for global dominance in this sector, but we do want to make sure that we have the kind of resilience and capability that we need here with sufficient economies of scale that we can bend a cost curve that it's not 4 times more expensive to build a ship here in the United States than in another country. And that's, I think, the like core objective of what we're after versus what they're after, which is like true sort of like dominance in this particular sector.
I think another key difference between us and sort of the way that I see China executing their industrial policy is that we're doing it alongside our partners and allies, right? We're not, when you look at the Chinese, they're hyper focused on their own industry and they're sort of going at it alone. Whereas we are, if you look at Icebreakers, we're doing it alongside Finland and Canada and working toward our collective interest, which is to sort of maintain the international order. And then similarly with cranes, cranes not only sort of supports U.S. industry, but it also looks to our partners and allies and invites them to the United States to partner up with us and to support us and to work alongside us. So we're not limiting ourselves by only looking to U.S. industry. We're expanding and looking across the oceans to our partners and allies and doing it along their side.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. Will alluded earlier to the sort of Buy America stuff, which one level limits a lot of what can be done on this. I don't know, when you like DM'd the Finns, when you called up the Finns, like, were they confused that someone from the White House wanted to talk about icebreakers? Like, what was give me the arc here.
Yeah, sure. They weren't confused. Like, the Finns know that they have the best capabilities. They know that they have one of the strongest shipyards in the world, and they've been trying to talk to us about icebreakers for a long time. But to build Coast Guard icebreakers, which is the government agency that builds and operates sort of icebreakers for the United States, in addition to some of our research arms, they have something called Title 14, which is kind of like the Build America, Buy America Act, which says that they have to build those ships here in the United States. And I think the president is like super clear about this. It's American ships and American shipyards. But that doesn't mean that we can't work together with Finland or with Canada to try to share information, exchange technical expertise, work together to send a message to their neighbor, Russia, that says basically like, we're going to work together on industrial policy, and democracies are going to work together to stand against autocracy and aggression by sort of like actors who are willing to violate international norms. And I think for President Stubb in particular, who's the new Finnish president, just elected in March, this is like a signature start of his administration that says we're going to be a partner for the United States. We're a member in NATO. And this deal is a representation of Finnish values, as well as a way to say like, hey, we're really good at building something. We have really strong industry here in Finland, and this is a good place to do business. So they were experiencing actually prior to their ascension to NATO, a slight economic downturn. And since joining, they've been experiencing what some folks would call like a NATO bump. And I think Pact is a sort of natural follow on from that, which says like, not only do Finnish shipyards make icebreakers, and should allies and partners around the world look to them as an alternative to, say, making an icebreaker in a adversary country, particularly if you're like a geopolitical swing state. But also like Finnish companies like Konecranes, Panamac, they make a lot of the key inputs to these types of vessels and also to efficient shipyards. So I think they looked at this, and we did some economic analysis with them in developing this concept. And I think we were able to come up with if you pull commodities out of our trade data, and you say sort of like how much like Finnish equipment are you going to need to buy in Canada and the US in order to like do best in class shipyards based on some underlying assumptions, like we think might be an increase in 4 or 5 percentage points in terms of the amount of goods and equipment manufactured by Finnish companies then flowing into allies and partners to build icebreakers. So that's some of why the Finns were like all in on this effort and why they're such important partners, because there's mutual benefits here for everybody involved.
William, I have a question. So all that being said, Finnish firms are also partners with Chinese firms. So China's first indigenously built icebreaker, Shuilong 2, was actually designed by a Finnish company. Is part of IcePac telling the Finns, hey, cut this out, stop designing Chinese ships? Or how does that work? Because, they have economic partnerships with China that predate this relationship with the United States.
Totally. Yeah. I think we should back up and like tell the story of the Helsinki shipyard, which I think we'll get at this question. So if we think about before 2019, the Helsinki shipyard, which has built the majority of the world's icebreakers, is like well known as the best. It worked closely with Aker Arctic, which is the state-owned corporation that has most of the IP for icebreakers. That's who the PRC bought the design from. The shipyard in Helsinki was actually owned by the United Shipbuilding Corporation, which is a Russian state-owned enterprise that was created by a presidential charter signed by President Putin back in like 2007. Sanctions regime in 2019 hits United Shipbuilding Corporation, forces them to sell their holdings to something called Algador Holdings, which is a Cyprus-based investment company owned by Russian businessmen. So like they're the new owners of the yard. And then 3 years later, they're not, Algador Holdings isn't getting hit with sanctions, but because they're trying to work with Russian businesses to build ships there in the Helsinki shipyard, as they've done traditionally over the last like 100 years, the secondary effects of sanctions on the companies they're trying to buy the ships start to prevent this shipyard from getting business from the Russians. And so they're forced, because of our restrictive economic statecraft tools, to sell the yard to Davy Shipbuilding, who's based in Canada. So now we basically our economic tools have encouraged basically the sale of this incredibly important strategic asset from Russian ownership to Canadian ownership. Then 1 year later, you've got Finland ascending into NATO. 1 year after that, we're inking IcePact, which is basically placing our arms around Finland and saying, we're democracies, we're going to collaborate on industrial policy, and we're going to send a message to autocracies in the world and U.S. adversaries that we don't view industrial policy as a zero-sum game. We view our alliances as fundamental to our strength abroad. And that difference, I think, is what's bringing Finland into the sort of NATO-led, US-led fold. And I think that's a strong message back to both the PRC and to the Russians about sort of what does it mean to basically try to compete with the United States, and how are we going to do it, and why is it different than the way that they do it? So we're sort of taking the opposite approach from the PRC. And I think that people see that because when the PRC bought that design from Aker Arctic, right, they built that ship in their shipyard, and then they didn't continue to work with the Finn. What we're talking about doing is technical exchange of IP, and a long-term relationship that's committed to the success of both of our countries, both job creation here in the United States, as well as job creation and the geopolitical strength of Finland. That's an offer that the Chinese can't make.
Well, so speaking of ships, so you've partnered with the Finns, and how are the Canadians treating this? Because in many ways we're obviously allies, extremely close nations, but also we're right next to each other in the Arctic. And are the Canadians as willing to invest in the United States shipbuilding capabilities as the Finns are?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, the way I would maybe start that, right, is the Russians and to some extent the Chinese are the pacing threat in terms of number of icebreakers. So the Russians, I think, are north of 40. Obviously, it's some of the most advanced, powerful in the world. They've been doing this a long time. The Chinese are at 3, maybe 4 now, total icebreakers, summer research vessels, etc. I think the Canadians are a natural partner here because no country in the world, with the exception of the Russians, are building as many ships as they're building, or as many icebreakers. So I think their fleet is like 20 plus, and they have on order or plans to build across 3 different shipyards in Canada: Irving, Seaspan, and Davie. Davie's the one that owns the yard in Helsinki too, but they also own a yard in Quebec. Something like 20 some plus or 28 icebreakers over the next 10, 15 years. So in terms of like, how are we keeping up? The Canadians are putting their money where their mouth is in terms of building icebreakers for use both domestically and then also to maintain that continuous surface presence in the United States. And Canada is just obviously one of our closest like geostrategic partners. Like they remember Five Eyes, et cetera. And this is like a natural area on which to partner because we have a lot to learn from Canada, and we're also putting our own investments into icebreakers. And I think that's the question that we have is sort of what kinds of expertise, what kinds of skills, what kinds of capabilities can we bring down from Canadian firms and apply here in the United States, supporting our shipyard, which is Ballinger Shipyard in Louisiana, to build what's going to be the first domestically built heavy icebreaker in the United States in the last 50 years, which is called the Polar Security Cutter. Polar Security Cutter 1. Now, the Coast Guard says we need like up to 9 icebreakers. That's a mix of these like heavy polar security cutters versus like medium ships, which will have to be created under something called the Arctic Security Cutter Program for medium icebreakers. Think like heavy icebreakers goes through thicker ice, can get down to Antarctica. Medium icebreakers goes through slightly smaller ice, often going up and working in the Arctic. I think that's that kind of collaboration and the interoperability that we're going to get by designing and building these ships together with the Canadians is going to allow us to use the Canadians and use ourselves and use the Finns as force multipliers. Because like in the high latitude, like I think there's a really good argument that you can't go at this stuff alone.
So some breaking news here. The Canadian coach of the women's soccer team has just been let go for flying drones over competing countries' practices. I'm curious if this, potentially might have any impact on your comfort in working with them on icebreakers going forward.
It sounds like the Canadians, they've got hustle,
Robert, anything else on ships before the meta industrial policy stuff?
No, I think William laid it out perfectly. Canada was just made sense. I think when we began, we were sort of going at this alone. I wound up at the Finnish embassy one night and found myself talking to sort of cutting edge industry people and realized that they wanted to partner up, and that's how it became a sort of bilateral thing. And then we wanted it to be a true multinational arrangement. So we started looking around and we looked to the north, and for all the reasons William just outlined, the Canadians just made sense. And so we gave them a call, and sure enough, they were interested.
What's up with Norway? They don't make icebreakers?
Yeah, this is a good like place to talk a little bit about the sort of like theory of the case in terms of economies of scale. When we were thinking through a sort of like, why is it so hard to build an icebreaker in the United States? We've been trying to build one for a while. It's been really difficult. We're a little behind schedule. We're a little over budget. We're seeing the same thing in yards in Canada. And when we looked around the world, what we realized is like shipyards that build icebreakers, 1-off, 2-off, 3-off vessels, they often experience like significant financial hardship where they go out of business. So I think the question that we were asking ourselves is, we can either get together as allies and partners and collaborate and try to invite allies and partners to consolidate demand around a group of shipyards that have experience and existing capital investment to build these kinds of highly specialized vessels. So like the Helsinki Shipyard, the Davie Shipyard in Canada, the Irving Shipyards, the Seaspan Shipyards, Ballinger Shipyard here in the United States. Or we can all go it alone and we won't reach the kinds of economies of scale and efficiencies in building these vessels that we think we might need. Robert and I worked some also on a demand study, and what we came up with is there's 70 to 90 vessels that governments around the world are going to try to buy over the next decade. And so the question is sort of what piece of that pie can the United States try to go and get, as well as can Canada and Finland try to go and get as well. And I think what we're trying to do is create that consortium that's an alternative to building in some place like the PRC for a geopolitical swing state that might want to purchase an icebreaker, folks in the Southern Cone, or anyone whose borders the Antarctic, or even we've seen reports that folks like India and the Gulf states want icebreakers as research vessels, etc. So that's sort of how we were thinking through that. But I think that the Norwegians and the Swedes, all the Nordic countries, as well as other partners, have a lot to offer in terms of expertise and capability. But when you really get down to brass tacks around who's put up money to build icebreakers and what yards, I think that the Finnish yard in Helsinki, the yards that are building the icebreakers in Canada, and our own yard and our own appropriations, we put what do we outright $1.8 billion into building the polar security cutters. That's sort of in our view, the economies of scale. But we were going to build in a mechanism to invite allies and partners to participate in future iterations of Pact. And I think that that's a good place for the Norwegians to come on board, or for the Swedes to come on board, or for whoever else might be necessary.
So staying on that topic just for one quick second. Ballinger Shipyards is the place that we're building those polar security cutters in Louisiana. Can you tell me a little bit about it? Because outside of Shanghai, they have one shipyard, Jianglang Shipyards, that has more capacity than all American shipyards put together. And that's just one of China's many shipyards. So what is going on at Ballinger Shipyards? How big is it? What are we making? Is this going to radically transform that place, or are they ready to hit the ground running?
Yeah, I mean, so Ballinger's already got the contract to build the polar security cutter, right? So that yard, it's really, Ballinger Shipyards is a Louisiana-based firm that has a variety of shipyards in the Gulf. The yard in Pascagoula in Mississippi, that's actually building the polar security cutter, is over the next sort of I think 5 years or so to finish the first PSC, and then subsequent PSCs, the table goes out after that, are going to be those shipyards are going to do a bunch of their own capital investment to develop the kind of specialized capabilities, expertise necessary to build these ships. And what we want to make sure that they have under Pact is a stable long-term order book. So we, the United States, are going to buy icebreakers. We've said through lots of public statements that we think we need 8 to 9. But in order to have the confidence to put capital investment to make this the core of your business, you need confidence that you're going to get more than one ship of a particular vessel specialty class built in order to get those kinds of economies of scale. So say we build a couple of ships for the Coast Guard in Ballinger's yard. That means we still need to help Ballinger go out and compete to build the icebreakers from that 70 to 90 global vessel order book that we were talking about earlier, so that they have the kinds of long-term stable contracts that are necessary for them to try and be a world leader in this sector. And that is if we can prove that out in this case under this particular vessel class, that's a model for how we create healthy, strong shipyards in the United States that are able to grab an increasingly larger share of the global order book of shipbuilding. And so that's some of what we're thinking about in terms of how does our shipyards fit into this? And I think that's one of the ways we think that Ballinger fits in.
So would you say that U.S. government capital is kind of an icebreaker, and private capital is going to be following in your way, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. Shipbuilding is undercapitalized, right? It's a really difficult business. You need a ton of money, and it has to be incredibly patient because the margins on building ships are really small. So you got to put up billions of dollars to build out a successful shipyard. And then you've got to train the workforce there. You've got to increase the density of the suppliers around the yard. The whole ecosystem that's largely being driven by, a multi-million, multi-billion, in some cases, dollar product that has a really small profit margin on it. So it's tough to be a shipbuilder. And I think the question that we have as the government is if ultimately what we want to take is our yard to a capability where they can build a ship that's high quality, cost effective, that's going to be sold out into the international market, not just used in a market protected by the Jones Act or for U.S. military purposes. That's a good use of government funds. And like the question is, how do we get that flywheel going, and how do we use the capital that the government is putting in through stuff like the Coast Guard contracts or through other grant programs or through other like investments, like I'm sure you guys have seen all of the sort of different bills floating around on the Hill right now talking about revitalizing American shipbuilding and developing a maritime strategy. I mean, Senator Kelly, Senator Wicker, a lot of these guys are like working hard on this particular difficult and tractable problem. But I think it's something that we can try to prove out using icebreakers, because there's like multiple justifications for why this is a good first case.
So that was an impressive display of knowledge, which I only have to imagine you accumulated over the past handful of months. But I think it sort of speaks to this broader question of whether like the US of A should be relying on like a handful of Williams just like happening to show up in the White House to do this, or if there's like some more institutionalized way of trying to tackle these sorts of questions that require different industry specializations and understanding of like the potential industrial policy carrots and sticks. Robert, I'd love to hear some broader reflections about playing in these waters and what long-term government capability in doing these sorts of things might look like.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, just having 2, 3, 4 people working on this is not efficient and not, frankly, that effective. But I think in order to truly institutionalize it, especially within like the national security community, we have to institutionalize the idea of carrots. Everybody in the national security community is used to using sticks, whether it be, the military sanctions or things like that. And nobody really ever looks to incentivizing private sector, partly because it doesn't come natural, but also because I don't think a lot of people understand how it all works or what is available to them. And so in order to really execute it properly at scale, we need to just continue doing it. And I think it needs to be a top-down approach where we, start directing our respective offices to have real industry analysts on hand that can sort of study the markets and figure out what tools and levers we have to help incentivize private sector to take actions that are advantageous to us. We should have an office at the NSC that is exclusively doing this, and teams at each department and agency in the national security space that are exclusively doing this, so that we're not sort of limiting ourselves to just sticks. There are plenty of carrots in our toolkit, and if we learn them and understand them and figure out how to use them effectively, frankly, it's more productive.
Robert hit it. This is an enormous team effort that in certain instances has to be driven by the White House, because you have to convince different departments and agencies who all have their own core missions to work with like a corporate mindset in the government. And that's like incredibly difficult to institutionalize. That's sort of like corporate style thinking, because how you actually institutionalize something in the government is you put it at an agency in some kind of entity. But I think Robert hit the nail on the head with the industry analyst point, which is in order to be really good at doing industrial policy and to encouraging capital markets to allocate capital in line with American strategic objectives, we have to really have people who deeply understand how capital markets work, how businesses make decisions, and how government action can incentivize and drive those decisions in ways that are valuable to us. And that's really hard to do, particularly in our system where, people have to think about, what is the 5-year IRR of my investment, as opposed to what is my investment unlocking for the American economy. And like I think that's just hard, but I think the government is like building that muscle. We're like experiencing it being built in real time right now. And I think it's gonna, I'm excited to see where it goes over the next 10 years.
I think just to add to that, William's absolutely right. Right. I think we've accepted as a community that the private sector is not driven by national security; it's driven by profit. But that's often where it stops, because there's a belief that we can't contribute to that. Right. So the only option is to use sticks to force you to take actions. But we can contribute. We can sort of have a relationship where we make this advantageous to you actually take these steps. But that requires a completely separate set of tools and a completely different way of thinking.
The United States has the most innovative financial system in the world, and our government has no ability to harness it. And so the question that we have is, how do we use the most dynamic, the most innovation forward economy in the world to help us compete with our adversaries in the current environment, particularly because I think over the next century, or the next at least couple of decades, competition in the economic sphere is going to be the determinative factor over sort of how successful we are as a country, and how our alliances are continued, and what's the sort of clear proof case that democracy is better than autocracy. And I think that that's something that we have to demonstrate. And if we don't, it's going to be really difficult for us to be successful going forward.
The sort of White House versus agency question, I think, is a really interesting one with these types of problems. And, the amount of different departments that we've sort of referenced or shouted out over the course of this interview just illustrates how two things. First, it's clear there does need to be some White House component, but also that maybe it might make sense to shift around some of these responsibilities within the interagency, to just allow there to be fewer people CC'd on email chains, so that you can have a little more rational way of going about this. I don't know if it's probably beyond your guys' remit to propose the Goldwater Nichols for Industrial Policy Act here on China Talk, but it really did strike out to me just how there shouldn't really be this many cooks in the kitchen when you're thinking about doing stuff like this.
Ideally, yeah, but I don't know if that's entirely possible. If you look at Icebreakers, the Coast Guard plays a significant and unique role. The Department of Transportation plays a significant and unique role. State Department, the same. And I don't know if there's any way to sort of consolidate that. I think what would be easier is if there was buy-in at an earlier stage, right? And that buy-in with sort of fundamentally accepting that we can play a role and sort of creating incentives for the private sector to take these actions. I think there's just a lot of fear that prevents people from doing that, or from thinking outside the box more broadly.
And so how does that change, Robert? Just through good case studies, or?
I mean, I think the messaging right now is coming from the top down, but it's so new that frankly most people haven't even heard of it. So we just need to continue doing it. Future administrations need to continue pushing industrial policy strategy that uses both sticks and carrots, and sort of pushing that down through the cabinet secretaries and through the departments, through the agencies, building up these really small offices that do exist at every department, but are largely operating in the shadows and as an afterthought, and just building it out. I mean, I feel like this is truly one of the first administrations where we're actually doing this effectively, and we're going to need a couple more cycles of this for it to really sort of build itself out. But you're seeing it slowly. I mean, William and I are turning people into believers every day, it seems like, and the more we do, the more we flip, the stronger the coalition becomes. And when we transitioned from cranes to shipbuilding, there was people on the sidelines that wanted to participate and get involved, that frankly wanted nothing to do with it the first time. So I think the more people will want to join.
I think it's worth putting that in historical context too, right? So if you think from the beginning of the United States, there's this initial era where we had a national industrial strategy, this thing called the American systems. We were doing investments in infrastructure. We were creating like a national bank. Then sort of at the beginning of the 20th century, towards the Second World War and immediately after, we did a bunch of major strategic investments that like developed all these emerging technologies and industries like microelectronics, biotech, et cetera. You hear a lot of guys like Brian Deese sort of like use these like terms around like there's like this initial era, this second era. And I think what we're on right now, at like catalyzed by like a multi-trillion-dollar effort through the Investing in America agenda, is like the beginning of a third era of American industrial policy. And it just takes a long time for like an entity that is the federal government that has millions of employees, many of whom like can't or don't talk to each other, to like let that seep in. We're like 3 or 4 years deep into that. And I think 5-10 years down the line, people who have like seen this as like the norm of the way the government does business are going to get better at doing their jobs. And it's just like change in the government at an institutional level is slow. Though we've like, we've also pitched ideas, Jordan, that I think you're alluding to, which is like, what if we had an agency focused on industrial policy? What if we had an agency focused on industrial analysis? I think those are ideas that have been proposed by Congress. I think we might even propose one of those in the Build Back Better agenda. But we'll see going forward how it sticks.
I don't want to speak for Jordan here, but that might be the first Henry Clay reference on China Talk. But this actually relates to Robert's point about it being, we need future administrations to do this, right? After Henry Clay's American system, which never really got passed in full, Andrew Jackson killed the national bank, right? And so how bipartisan is this thinking? And so as much as we want a 10,000-year reign of Joe Biden, it's obviously coming to an end in January, and we don't know what'll happen in the election. But, is this bipartisan? Or is your guys' thinking on how to promote shipbuilding, ship capacity shared by people in the Republican Party?
I think the infrastructure is bipartisan. So we have that sort of foundation to build off of. And I think, the strategy that we're employing, which is sort of incentivizing the private sector, is new, but interesting and not something people are sort of running away from.
Yeah, I mean, we're the National Security Council, right? So like we can't do politics. But I think a really good sort of thing that I would point you to, Alex, on that question is, after we put out the work that we did initially on ship-to-shore cranes, and after we put out Ice Pact, you saw the House Homeland Security Committee Chairman, Mark Green, the Subcommittee for Transportation and Maritime Security Chairman, Carlos Jimenez, both Republicans from Texas and Tennessee, put out supportive statements about the work that we're doing. Finding this, that I find it's extremely encouraging. And when you look at that in the context of like this like otherwise polarized, occasionally partisan environment, that is like a really bright spot that I think is indicative of the kinds of support that we hope that everybody can get behind. Because it's hard to argue with wanting to create a strong domestic economy in the United States that allows us to project power out into other parts of the world.
We're also fundamentally putting American business first and looking out to strategic alliances when we alone can't do it. But it's a blend of both ideologies.
The first of many Icebreaker focused podcasts here on China Talk. Robert, Will, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.